Today, I want to tell you some stories. Today, I want to take you on a little bit of a journey, which will tell you a little more about me and hopefully a little more about yourselves. So where to start? I'm going to ask you a question first. What sound does silence make? I want you to all close your eyes. Take a deep breath and listen. Now I'd like you to open your eyes, and if you have some paper, you can either write down or you can think for yourself. Write down what sound you heard in the silence. Just write it down for yourself. You don't really need to ask anyone's opinion because they didn't hear what you heard. I know this is a challenge sometimes in a lecture theatre. We all revert to type and start asking our next door neighbour, what's the answer? Okay, but on this occasion, the answer is within you. So just write for yourself a note of what silence meant or what you heard in that time. As human beings, we very rarely listen to silence. I think in the 21st century it's quite difficult actually because there's always noise, isn't there? There's always something catching our ear or our sound. And actually, I think what we do, or certainly what I do, is that when it's completely silent, and you may have done this yourself, you start trying to listen for a sound, and you hear things that you wouldn't normally hear. So there's a gentle hum, isn't there, from these machines that are in here. You might have heard the door go, and you can almost in your head feel yourself latching on to the sounds around you to kind of anchor yourself somewhere. Because in your head is space, and in that space you're not quite sure where you're supposed to go. I'm going to tell you later what silence sounds like for me, but I want you to just hold on to that thought about silence, just because that's where we're starting from. This talk and the stories I'll share with you are about silencers. They're about my silencers, and some of them you will share. Some of them will be so different from what you've experienced, and some of them will be similar to stories you've heard before. The stories of silence sit in those spaces between my experience and yours, and your experiences with your colleagues, your friends, your neighbours, and even your families. My silencers are housed in my identity as a black, female, nurse, academic. The order of those words are really important to me. Black, female, nurse, academic. Keep that in mind as we go through. It's a long time since I've done this. It's a long time since any nurses have done this. 1982, and I've started my nurse training. I'm a first-year nurse, and it's my first day on a surgical ward. I'm really excited. I'm really excited because I've left geriatrics behind. It is 1982, and I can say geriatrics in 1982. And it's my first proper nursing ward. When I came for my interview for nursing, this is what I thought nursing was about. I've watched Angels, for those of you who are at least as old as me. Holby City and Casualty are just a distant dream that somebody's not yet had. And I've not slept. I'm on an early shift. I have to be there at 7 o'clock. The night before, I've not slept. I'm really, really nervous because I can't remember how to do hospital corners. And I'm practicing them in my mind. Pull, turn, under. You see, all those nurses who've done that know that movement. But I'm practicing it over and over in my head because I know the first thing I have to do on my shift is do the beds. First year nurse on a surgical ward, we're doing the beds. So I appear on the wards, I walk to the linen cupboard, and we get the metal trolley out. I can see some people reminiscing. We get the sheets and the pillowcases and the counterpanes, and we pile them all up. We've got the spray to wipe down the plastic, and I'm pushing it out onto the ward with the person in charge of me who's a third-year nurse. We go up and down the Nightingale ward, and the first thing we do is we make each patient get out of bed, sit on a chair next to the bed, and we strip the bed. So all the beds are stripped, and now we're ready to make the beds. We've cleaned them down. We walk to the first bed. I'm thinking, turn, twist, under, tuck. That's all that's going in my head. Turn, twist, under, tuck. We come to the first bed, and I pick up the sheet and put it on the bed. And the patient says, no. And I look at the patient, and I said, excuse me? And he says, no. I don't want a black nurse making my bed because your hands are not clean. And I say, but I've washed them. I've done everything. I've even done the bits in between. You know, they could get their lamp out and I would not have any lines, any blue on my hands. I've scrubbed them to within an inch of their lives. So I go away and think, I better wash them again. So I walk down the ward where the sink is and I wash my hands again. And I come back. And the patient says, no, I'm not having you wash me or my bed or make my bed. The third year student doesn't know what to do. She looks at me, I look at her. We look at each other. And then she said, I'll get sister. So I'm standing there with the sheet, still like this. I've not moved. And sister comes along. So, what's going on here? What's going on? She looks at me and says, student nurse, what are you doing? I'm not doing anything. He won't let me make the bed. So she says to the patient, what's the problem? And he said, I don't want that black nurse touching my sheets and I don't want her touching me. And the third year student looks at sister and sister looks at me and says, well, in that case, Nurse Serrant, why don't you go and do the bedpans? And she walks me along the ward and I spend the shift in the room cleaning metal bedpans. And that's my first shift. Often, when we talk about inequalities, we think about structure. We think about situations in which people live. We think of pictures like this. We think about poverty. We think about how people manage to live after war. We think about economic deprivation. We think about far-flung countries where people don't have the facilities, the resources, or the professionals to help them. And we think about the importance of education and education of young people as a way to improve people's life and health chances. But what we don't think about in inequalities often are the stories that lie within the data. The experiences, the emotions, the information, and the ways in which what happens to people affects their life, their health, and their chance. For me, speaking about silence, speaking about inequalities is much more than the structural. The structural is the situation in which we live our lives. And to talk about inequalities and chance or privilege without talking about people is to render those people silent, unaccounted for, and unspoken. I want to start thinking about me and my position. We must start by thinking about why I use the terminology that I use. In this presentation and in my everyday speech, I use the term black. And I use the term black as a political term to reference the experiences and the situations, the diversity and the intersectional experiences of people whose skin is not white. That's not to say that we're the same. That's not to say we're all equal. That's not to say we all have the same chance. But what it does say is that externally at least, we have one shared social measure of worth. The thing about being black is that I can't hide it. I could hide my sexuality. I can hide my economic status. I might even be able to hide my educational ability. And I can certainly hide where I live, because none of you know, apart from maybe 2 people, where that is. But the thing about not being able to hide a portion of yourself is that it's easy for people to think that when they see that portion of yourself, they know who you are. My first message is, knowing my race and knowing my ethnicity is the least thing you know about me. It may be one of the main things that you reference to as an organization, as an individual, or as a team, but it's the least thing you know about me. What you don't know are my stories of self, how I position myself, the things that have shaped who I have become, and the things that are important to me in the future for where I will go and what I will do. So I want to share those stories of self and move you forward. This is where it all started. This is my mum and dad. What you can't see from here is, because of very strategically held flowers, is my mother is pregnant with me in that picture. This is them getting married on their wedding day, which was in Nottingham, in an area called Lenton, if anybody knows Nottingham well. I was the 4th of their children, but I was the first one to be born in England. And they got married because it was expected to be married in England. And just as a reference point, you see the relatively grey, even though it's black and white, this is April in England where they're getting married. And the picture there that I took on the beach quite close to where our family home is in Dominica. You will see there's at least one Dominican here. Well, there's 2 of us now. That's almost a crowd in Dominica, we're that small. Anyway, so the beach, what you'll notice about the beaches in Dominica is the sand is black. So to some extent, it doesn't look like people expect the Caribbean to look. You know, the palm trees are there are other trees there, no white sand, but the sea is blue and it's warm. And my parents, in their wisdom and bravery, left this place to come to this place. And it is a story of bravery, because their movement was pushed by a need to actually improve the opportunities and particularly the educational opportunities for their children. When they left Dominica and came initially, my brothers stayed in Dominica and they came later. Not an unusual story of families and peoples with a migratory history. What you maybe don't know from this is that in Dominica, the first spoken language is not English. That's the official written language. Our first language is French Creole. So the first language that I spoke and I heard as a child was French Creole. So although I may appear to speak eloquently to you, I spend a lot of time translating in my head. I once had a student who said to me, I really like the way you speak because you take these pauses and you think and you ponder on the words. And I'm thinking, I'm just trying to think what the English word is for what I'm trying to say. But that's my reality. A constant line of translation, retranslation, going backwards and forwards in my head. And sometimes, and if anybody has more than one language, the English word doesn't quite cut it. But as an academic, as a nurse working here in England, I have to use the best guess and the nearest thing. And that's my normality, every day, all the time. But of course, eventually I came out of there. This is me, aged 1. So I'm going to tell you a bit about my data. These are my statistics. And this is a nod to those people who are quantitative researchers as opposed to the qualitative researcher I have become. This is me at the age of 1. I was born at home, in the front room, on the settee, delivered by my dad. I was 9 pounds and 12 ounces. I know. Yeah. We lived in what was relative poverty, although I never felt poor one day in my life as a child. It was only when they started knocking it down in the slum clearance we kind of got a clue that really it probably was quite poor. I'm the eldest girl in 7. There are 3 boys ahead of me and there are 3 girls after me. And in Dominican culture, that makes me the head of the household after my parents. I could read all my letters by the age of 3. And at the age of 4, I could read. I went to school in England. And I was put in the remedial class because I spent too much time not reading and talking. Mainly because I'd read the book they gave me when they'd given it to me and I didn't know what else to do. There was nothing else at that point. This interest in reading carried on. I think when I was age 7 or 8, we used to go weekly to the library. Do you remember when people used to do that? Take all your books to the library. I remember one of the things that we did was argue a lot because I used to carry all the books to the library and my sister was supposed to carry them home, but she never did. But when I finished school and when we were getting that careers education, I did 11 GCSEs, well, O-levels. See, I'm trying to make myself younger now. I did 11 O-levels and I sat for A-levels. And amazingly, as maybe all my A-levels were sciences. The 3 sciences and pure maths. You might be thinking, how did you become a qualitative researcher after that? And the careers advice I was given at school was, well, you like reading, you'd be really good at driving a mobile library. Oh. 1994. I've just had my second son. How come the second ones are never like the first ones? The first one lulled me into a false sense of security. And the second one was boisterous and he was loud and he was fabulous and still is. Now, when he was a few days old, I was at home and the midwife came and the health visitor came to see me, to do the weigh-in and check the baby over and all those sorts of things. And it was a young midwife who came, and she picked up my son, weighed him, checked him over, talked to me, said, is he all right? I said, yes, he's fine, no problem at all. And then she said, oh, can I examine him? I said, yes. She took his clothes off and she examined him. And then she said, okay, that's fine. I might come back later, she said. I thought, oh, that's nice. I didn't have that with the first one. It must be, you know, maybe the cutbacks aren't as bad as I thought they were going to be. Anyway, she went away, and an hour later she came back with her supervisor. And they said, can we check your son? Yeah, of course you can. There he is. They weighed him. They took his clothes off. They checked him. And then they said to me, how are you coping with motherhood? Fine. It's all right. It's my second son. You know, I am the eldest girl in the family of 7. You know, babies are not a new thing. Okay. And she said, we're just a bit concerned about the marks on your child. I said, what marks on my child? She said, he appears to have a lot of bruises. And I said, my child hasn't got any bruises. That is what's called Mongolian blue spot. It's a birthmark. It's a congenital birthmark, which is in children with dark skins. Now, the father of my children, my husband at the time, is white English. So, although my middle son was a little darker, his skin wasn't as dark as mine. And the midwife looked at me and said, but we have to be very careful about non-accidental injury. And I said, of course you do, but this is a birthmark. And she said, I'll have to phone up and check. So she phoned and she checked and was told it was true. And she said, okay then, that's fine, your son's okay. And she left my house. The silences that pressure us and the silences that impinge on our lives don't always come at a time when we expected them. Now that was an issue. I wasn't really angry with the health visitor at that time because she was doing her job. Because if that had been non-accidental injury, she did absolutely the right thing. My challenge was her education was lacking, because her education did not prepare her for checking babies with different skin colours. As a nurse educator now, I'm still not convinced that throughout our profession that we make sure that our students, whether it's midwifery, nursing, or any other allied health professional, is adequately prepared to care for people with a variety and a diversity of skin colours that they will come across. My question is, if they are not prepared and able to do that, we do every student a disservice. And the question is, are they truly fit to practice in the 21st century if they cannot do that? What became even more apparent to me as I went through the 1990s and my work in the 80s and into the 90s was that this, which was a book that I read age 7, was true. That actually it was my experience and the experience of friends that I had, that while we were equal, there were people who were more equal than we were. Maybe because they didn't look like us, maybe because they lived in better houses, maybe because they had better education, or maybe just because it was an uneven field. When we think about all the reasons and all the things that impact on health and life chances, for me, when I first started nursing, I worked around HIV and AIDS care. In no place and no kind of work have I ever seen the inhumanity of man to man, woman to woman, person to person, as working in AIDS care in the 80s and 90s. Sex, lies, and morality. And overlaid on that was again working as a nurse, facing again that question, but aren't you from Africa? Aren't you in one of the high-risk groups? Is that why you're working in AIDS care? Over and over again, your story gets mistold in your own presence. And then I met this angel mother, Elizabeth Onwenu. How many people have not heard of Elizabeth Onwenu? That's your homework. Okay. Elizabeth Onwenu, who's now a Dane, was a nurse, and it's because of Elizabeth that we even have sickle cell thalassemia listed as a medical condition in textbooks. It's not that she didn't discover it as a condition, but it was just not listed. And she worked at the time in Wolverhampton as a health visitor, and obviously was working with families and individuals and communities that were living with sickle cell. And yet in her training, it had never been mentioned, and it wasn't there in her health visitor training either. And she pushed and she lobbied and set up one of the first drop-in centres around sickle cell and thalassemia. Now we've all heard of it. And what Elizabeth did for me is she was one of my first mentors right back in the about 1996, I think I met her. And she persuaded me how to channel the frustrations around the personal, the political, the professional, and walking that line constantly and continuously. She persuaded me that I needed to find a way to speak. I needed to find a way to get other people to speak and find a way to get other people to be heard. She supported me in applying for my first research grant before I got my PhD. And I got the Mary Seacole Fellowship, which allowed me to do a small pilot study and to look at some of the questions that had bugged me continuously when I worked in AIDS care. Mainly, why we had so much data that showed that black men and black Caribbean men in particular were up to 16 times more likely to have a sexually transmitted infection. They were 16 times more likely at that point to die from a preventable infection and less likely to actually seek out any help. So I did that work, and through that work, I actually was able to get the award. I was able to start to answer some of the stories and the questions that I knew to be true, both personally and professionally with my work out in the community as an HIV nurse. The stories of how and why people's labelling affected their ability or their willingness to go and seek help and care. And eventually, after I did that award, I got funding and I was able to do my PhD. And in that PhD, it focused on black Caribbean men, silencers, and decision making. I felt great, I got a PhD, fabulous. The day after, please come in. The day after I'd got the award, my mother rang me up and said, "You're in the Caribbean paper." I had to say the Caribbean paper because if I say the Dominica Chronicle, only one person will know what that is, okay, apart from me. And I thought, great, let me look at the cutting. We proudly stood there with my sister-in-law, my husband at the time, my best friend from school, and my dad took our picture, and this is what came out. 5 years of hard work, evidence, theoretical frameworks, academic endeavour ended in a headline. It just shows you can't control everything. Okay. What this did do was actually get me invited to be part of the group that put together the first national HIV and sexual health strategy for England in 2001. And that was the start of my work trying to guide politicians and policies that would actually have a much more inclusive and diverse approach to finding solutions to health, care, and life chances. I know that's going to end up on Twitter, so I'm going to move on. 2008. It's a year after I got my first chair in nursing. I was quite shocked when I got the job. You know, it was one of those things where you apply for a job thinking, I probably won't get it, but I'm going to apply for it to see how far away I am from the mark, and then they give it to you. But anyway, I'd been working around HIV and AIDS care. I was working around community and public health. I'd been working on policies at that time. I'd worked with the Basement Project in London and London Lighthouse, the Terence Higgins Trust. I'd worked with prostitute outreach work. It was all the exciting stuff. And as a professor, I had a meeting with the Director of Public Health, and I went to meet him. He told me he'd only have half an hour to see me, and I'd met him at many, many, many meetings. So I said, okay, I'll get there at 1:45, because he's seeing me at 2:00 to 2:30. I went to the office. I'd not been to his office before. I went to the office, I gave my name at the desk, and I said, I'm here to see the Director of Public Health. I'm a bit early. And the receptionist said, yeah, no problem, just take a seat, and I'll give you a shout when he's ready. So I took a seat. At 1:50, I thought, well, I've not heard anything. Let me just make sure, because she was very busy. Let me just make sure that, you know, she hasn't forgotten I'm there, because I know I've only got a half-hour window. I went up to the desk and I said, I'm just reminding you I'm here. She goes, no problem, just sit down. I'll tell you when he's ready. I sat down again. At 1:55, I'm starting to think, now he's usually early. I'm never late, and I don't want to be late this time. I stood up again. And as I stood up, she went, it's okay. I know you're there. I sat down. At 2:05, I thought, hang on a minute, something's not right. I got up and I went to the desk and I said, I'm really sorry, but I know he's only got half an hour, and I really need to make sure that I don't waste his time, and we really just need to have a quick meeting. And she said, look, I've told you. I will tell you when he's ready. He's got a very important visitor. He's waiting for a professor. And I said, that'll be me then. And as she stood up, the Director of Public Health came out of the room and said, Laura, where have you been? You're never late. And I said, I wasn't late this time either. And as I turned and I followed him, she stood up and she shouted, it's just that you weren't what we were expecting. And I said, good. And I walked into my meeting. People talk about and speak about resilience. They speak about being strong and resisting the microaggressions, the things that wear you down. But I talk about cognitive diversity. That is how we learn who we are through how people treat us, what they think and they feel and they experience when they're in our presence or they hear of us. Sometimes the resilience, the resistance feels like balancing too many things. Sometimes it feels like being squashed and compressed by the pressures of the things that you have to do. And sometimes it feels like being down in a deep, deep hole where you're just waiting for someone to help you out. And sometimes it feels like just being out of earshot of the conversation. Resilience and resistance are what keep us going on that personal, professional path. It's not about proving my worth, but it often gives me a reflection of what people think my worth is. It's learning about myself and my place in every situation, and relearning that in every new situation, and relearning that in every new day. What I've learned, Malcolm kindly said 35 years, it's actually 38 years since I started my nurse training. What I've learned is how to walk the line between inside and out. And that's what we all do. We do it as students, we do it as practitioners, we do it as academics, we do it as people. We learn how to walk the line. I like this picture because it's quite difficult to tell who's inside and who's outside the bars. And that fluctuates. And it's not just the preserve of people with a skin of a particular colour, it's the preserve of people who, through variety of characteristics, a variety of reasons to be outside the conversation, manage this. Whether we do that on economic status, on sexuality, on race, on gender, or on all 3, 4, 5, and 6 together. We learn to walk the line. 2018, for me, it was a perfect storm. Perfect. Because 2018 signified things that impacted all parts of my identity as a black woman, nurse, academic. 2018 had the highs of getting the OBE. 2018 had the lows of the Windrush scandal. 2018 was 70 years of NHS. 2018 was 70 years since the Empire Windrush landed at Tilbury Docks, bringing the nurses and the practitioners who saved the NHS 1 month after its inception, when we realised we didn't have enough people to actually staff this wonderful institution. And without those people from the Commonwealth, it would have fallen at the first hurdle. 2018 also marks something that I did in Black History Month, and I apologise to some of my friends who've heard this many times. 2018 marked me learning, as Elizabeth said to me, how to speak. And what I did was I started, for the first time, to share something else you might not know about me, that I write a lot of poetry. And the first time I performed any of my poetry in public was at the Chief Nursing Officer's annual conference, the Black and Minority Ethnic Strategic Conference, when I wrote a poem to manage that line I'd been walking as nurse, as academic, as black woman in the face of Windrush. And I'm going to share it with you, with your permission. The poem is called "You Called and We Came." You called and we came, in ships bigger than anything we'd ever seen, dwarfing out islands and covering them in the shadows of smoke and noise. Crowded, excited voices filled the air, travelling to the motherland. Over weeks, over oceans that threatened to engulf us, driven by a wish, a call to save, to rebuild and support efforts to establish health for all in the aftermath of war. You called and we came, women and men of position in our homelands, Nurses with a pride in the excellence of our care, with experience of management, organisation, and a sense of duty. We appeared, smiling and eager to work on the wards and the clinics of this England. You called, and we came. Our big hands, big hearts, skillful hands, and quick minds encased in our skins of a darker hue, which had shimmered and glowed in our islands, but now signified our difference, our unbelonging. Matrons became assistants, nurses became like chambermaids, and all the while striving to fulfill our promise to succour, to serve, to care. You called, and we came. The blue of the sisters' uniform seemed as far away to us as the moon, unreachable by our dark hands in this cold land. But we were made of sterner stuff. The hot sun which had once beat down on our ancestors as they too left their lands, shone within us, forging our hearts and our minds with the resistance of ebony. You called, and we came. Rising like the phoenix from the heat of rejection, we cared, we worked, and we organised, until the quickness of our brains and the excellence of our care made it hard for you to contain us. And slowly, so slowly, the blue uniforms had darker and lighter skins beneath them. The professional care in our touch was valued, despite the strangeness of our speech and the kinks in our hair. You called, and we came. A new millennium, new hope spread across this land, new populations engaging and reflecting the varied, diverse, and vibrant natures of these shores. Moves to melt the snow at the peaks of our profession. Recognising the richness of our kaleidoscope nation, where compassion, courage, and diversity are reflected in our presence and our contribution, not only the hopes and dreams of our ancestors. Human values needed to truly lead change and add value. Remember, you called. Remember, you called. Remember, it was us who came. George Santana, a 21st century philosopher born in Spain, but living in the US, said, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." And so here we are in 2020, and we're still reloading, repeating, and replaying the things, the silences, the experiences that I've shared with you so far. We talk about workforce race equality standards. We listen to the evidence from Michael West and from Roger Klein about the poor ways in which black nurses are still treated within the NHS and their reduced chances of development, and how, if we actually treat all nurses with the respect that they deserve and they earn, patients get better care. We talk in education, in higher education, about equality of experience and equity of chance, and yet we have attainment gaps. And yet we still have curriculum, we still have places where we don't reflect our students in what we say and what we do and how we prepare them for the 21st century. Repeat, reload, replay. We measure results, but But what's missing is the stories of the people alongside those results. Because in those stories are the silent things that we have yet to hear, the silent things that will give us another option, a different opinion, perhaps a better chance of achieving what we want. The moral argument is one. We don't argue for the moral argument, but we struggle with the actions that we need to do to achieve that. The silence of the voices that we need to hear is deafening. I talked earlier about resilience. Remember this being squashed down in the hole, all that. And that's usually how people think about it. But actually, weathering is about bringing about change in something by continuous exposure to the atmosphere. And weathering also brings quite positive things too. This is not a sad story. I have chosen to share the stories with you. I have gifted you those stories from my silent spaces because I trust you to use that information well. I took this picture of Audre Lorde down on the Jurassic coast. And it shows how weathering, while it changes something, can bring about something so beautiful but equally as strong. There are two people's words who relatively, I think, reflect the way I think about my weathering now. One of them is Desmond Tutu. Desmond Tutu was once interviewed. You know how he's always smiling and joking and laughing? And they said, "Reverend, you're always so happy. How do you do it with all these things that you see and all the things that go wrong?" And what Desmond Tutu said, "I'm not always happy, but I travel hopefully," which I thought was great. The other person is Gina Miller. How many people remember Gina Miller? Gina Miller was a brave woman. It didn't quite work out in the end how I wanted, but hey-ho, I'm getting over it slowly. Gina Miller challenged the government. She challenged the way in which Brexit was being conducted. And in the year when I was in the top 10, fortunate enough to be in the top 10 in the power list of the most influential black people in the United Kingdom, Gina Miller was number 1. And when she stood on that podium, they said to her, "You must be really brave. You have no fear. And is that why you do what you do?" And she said, "I do what I do because I'm fearful, not because I'm fearless. I'm fearful of inaction and what happens if I don't speak out." Do you remember me asking you that question? It might seem like 4 days ago to you now. What sound does silence make? What I want you to do is just have a look at the paper or think about what you wrote right at the beginning of this session. And just think about it for yourself while I share with you what my silence sounds like. And I share with you from my head, from experiences in the last few months, I'll share with you that. And what I want you to do is actually to think about how closely my silences mirror yours, or what you think about your silence in hearing mine. Silence is stares when you walk into the room and being asked if you're in the right place. My silence sounds like being asked by a fellow traveller on a train whether I realise I'm sitting in first class. My silence sounds like smiling and relaxing my posture to make you feel at ease. My silence sounds like keeping my voice light while a complete stranger decides they want to touch my hair to see what it feels like. My silence sounds like translating words in my mind from Creole to English and then English back to Creole so that we can communicate. My silence sounds like catching the eye of another black person as I walk down the street and giving that little smile. My silence sounds like scanning each classroom I walk in to see how many black and minority ethnic students are in the room. My silence sounds like noticing that they're looking at me so that I know they've seen me. My silence sounds like seeing my mother in every cleaner and every caterer and every support person in the building and remembering their names. My silence sounds like knowing you're a commodity and learning to live with it. My silence sounds like sitting with a patient long after everybody's gone, with no discussion of race or creed or ethnicity. My silence sounds like feeling the pain of a black student nurse reliving my past. My silence sounds like planning strategies to fix them, to fix us, to fix me. My silence sounds like people afraid to get it wrong, so waiting for me to take the lead. My silence sounds like no one looking at you when the word racism is mentioned. My silence sounds like feeling the weight of expectations of my community and shifting my shoulders to bear it a little longer. My silence sounds like hearing my story mistold over and over again. My silence sounds like exhaling and thanking the ancestors for the strength they've given me and the laughter they've gifted me. My silence sounds like learning to stand up, stand out, and speak up. Silence is me. Thank you for your time.